Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Catholic Spirituality and All Things Catholic, where we talk about the mystical, the supernatural, and also things that are Catholic, that are relevant to our Catholic faith and our practicing of our Catholic faith. And I hope you're having a good week. July 4th is upon us. Can you believe how fast this summer is going by? I hope everyone has a safe and a spirit-filled July 4th as we celebrate our country's independence. Always a great day filled with a lot of family fun and a lot of remembrance of all the sacrifices that those have made, especially the ultimate sacrifice in our country's ongoing battle for freedom, especially these days when things are really seem to be at a crossroads, when there's so much disunity rather than unity in so many facets of our civilization. And anyway, we hope we can pray that we get this unity back. Anyway, with that, we're going to start the program. And this is a personal opinion of mine. You know, many people, I'm sure, around the dinner table, conversation with friends at the workplace, people talk, you know, what's wrong with society today? What's wrong with people today? What's wrong with families today? And, you know, what's wrong with the church today? And there are many multifaceted answers to these questions, and certainly we're not going to touch on all of them but on the show today. But I want to talk on the problems that arise in our church, and this is just a personal opinion of mine. And I think we have done a great disservice to the parishioners of our churches in the Roman Catholic faith when we have tried to strip down the supernatural aspect of our faith, the miraculous aspects of our faith, and in talking about things like hell and demons, the final four things, you know, which are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. We tend now, I think, again, personal opinion, to lean toward the social aspect of the church and how we can make society better, and that's all part of it. That comes right out of the Gospel of Matthew 25. We were to feed those who are hungry and clothe those who are naked and visit those who are in prison and do the corporal acts of mercy. You know, these are all good things. But the bottom line, I think, is that no matter, even if we do these things and we alleviate suffering, which is a great thing, and we should strive to do that among our brothers and sisters in the world, eventually, even with that, no matter what heights we can reach of that in making the society better, more peaceful, what have you, we're all going to die. And at the end of our lives, we will be judged by Christ, and we are going to live somewhere in eternity. Now, in the final judgment, there will only be heaven and hell. As Catholics, we believe that there's a purgatory, a purgative place for our souls to purify us, to take away any stain of sin. For we must be sinless completely when we get to heaven. So, at the end, when the new creation is created by Christ, we will have just those two places to live, and we will live forever, this time with no more separations or tears. That being said, most of us have seen how fast, I mentioned even at the beginning of the show, how quick summer seems to be passing by. And this is true for our lives. We have children. Before you know it, they're out of the cradle and they're having children of their own, and we're grandparents. And loved ones pass away, and we realize many cases, especially with tragedies in the world today, how fragile life is. And then what happens after? So even if we get 50, 60, 70, 100 years, it's still quick. But eternity is forever. And I think when we don't, as a faith community, as a church, when we don't talk about these things, and yes, in society, because, especially Western culture here in the States, we don't want to talk about death. We try to gloss over it, make this the society about young and what that is the most important thing, and not to age, and don't worry about the experience of the elderly. It's all about the youth and the youth movements today. And we do a disservice to ourselves because we are going to live after this life, absolutely. And the question is where? And that is, for me, the most important question and action that the Catholic Church can take is for the salvation of souls. Primary job number one. So, if that is true, then we need to talk about the supernatural battle that can cause us the loss of our soul to spend an eternity with Satan in hell. And that is where there seems to be some roadblocks, that we want not to really delve into that as a church, that we don't want to lean on the history's tremendous miracles throughout its 2,000-year history. And all the while, as a Catholic, you are not obligated to believe in apparitions like Fatima or Lourdes or Guadalupe. I think it would behoove us if we heard more of this from the pulpit about these apparitions and about what their message is that the Blessed Mother, as a gift from God, has come to tell us about repentance and forgiveness and coming back to God. And this is not just true of the Catholic Church, because Christians from other Protestant denominations rarely, if ever, hear about this themselves. And again, that spiritual aspect is also taken away. And so some of this, our discussion tonight, it comes from a great article on from the Christian Post on this very fact of these Christian denominations not hearing about what the Catholics are not hearing about. And I've mentioned before on other shows, there's an uptick in the occult. And we've done some shows on some of the games, witchcraft, Satanists, wizards, tarot cards, and these things that people tend to trivialize and not really be concerned about. And yet they can open the door, a portal that can be extremely dangerous for not only our souls, but our life right now on earth. And again, this is a topic, it seems, that we don't want to touch, and this is the demonology. And there was a conference a while ago. Now, I've mentioned before that our diocese has an exorcist priest. These priests are now being trained in the rite of exorcism because of the uptick in the occult and full possessions. Now, I've done a show, it's archived, on what the differences is between full demonic possession, like in the famous book, and we did a show on that case that inspired Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist, to do the book and then the movie, and what other forms of manifestations there are. So you might want to check that out. But they are now giving courses to our priests so that they can perform the rite of exorcism. And the Catholics gave at what's called a Q conference, gave a conference on demonology. And it was somewhat of a crash course on how demons behave and how exorcisms work so that people can talk about it. Now, this went over very, very big. And as a matter of fact, a gentleman, Gabe Lyons, who is the founder of Q, he said that the talk on the spiritual world, the spiritual aspect that they engaged in, was one of their top talks. And the people were really caught up, and they raved about it and thought it was great. And there was a gentleman there, Adam Bly, and he was emeritus of religious demonology. And what that means, and also exorcism. And he's out of the Diocese of Pittsburgh, where they train the priests in exorcism. And emeritus means that he's a theological consultant or advisor to a church council on these matters. So it's pretty heady stuff. And a lot of the information in the show comes from what he has ascertained. And one mistake that we make also is that, St. John talks about in the Gospel, in Revelation, that it's like a thin veil between our material world, the world that is reality for us now, and the spiritual. And it's just this thin veil. And in that regard, if we choose to look at the spiritual world, it can become more physical for us in this world, a way to approach and live our lives in a much more concrete spiritual way and physically way on our humanity that we can put into practice, and we can make it more interesting. And I think that would draw other people back to Christ, back to the Catholic Church, and back to the Protestant denominations who are also losing people. And, for people that think this is kind of a pie-in-the-sky approach, when we look at Hollywood, or we look at the books, or we look at television shows, I just mentioned that there's such an uptick in the occult that there's movies and books and TV shows made all about this. So the need is there. And not necessarily do Hollywood or books or television give us the best way to approach this. But that need, they see it because it's about money. And they see the need, the interest that people have in the supernatural. So they see it. And at times our church is lacking in that we don't see that. I guess it's because, we're afraid to talk about this. We don't want to drive people away. And we don't want to talk about that heavy stuff. And yet, it's all part of the spiritual battle. You can't have one without the other. Christ came to save us because sin is so awful, to make himself a sin offering, to open up those gates of heaven again that were closed after the sin of Adam and Eve. And when we look at the Gospels, exorcisms and Christ confronting demons, they're constituted about a third of these miracles that Jesus performed in the Gospels. So, as Mr. Blythe noted, you're talking about something very real and physical, but you're also talking about something, and this is the crux, that's really central to the gospel. Because, again, trying to water down things. I mean, you've heard people say possibly that, the real miracle of the fish and loaves was that they shared. But that's a watered down gospel, because the miracle is that Christ took some fish and he took some bread, and they had enough to feed thousands and thousands of people with baskets left over. And that miracle prefigured this incredible miracle as Catholics that we have, which we did a show last week on the Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. So you can't water these things down. It's the same thing as saying that, Christ didn't really exorcise demons out of the people or confront and battle demons. They had diseases of the mind and a lot of psychiatric problems that we know of now that they couldn't have in that ancient world. But that's absurd. That's absurd. Let me tell you, If those ancient people saw people levitating off the ground, eyes rolled back in the back of their head, guttural sounds, speaking in languages very clearly that they could not understand, superhuman strength, they would have known, my gosh, there's something really, really strange going on here. And they would have seen the demonic firsthand and would have no question or no problems in recognizing it and naming it. So to say that Christ just, alleviated psychiatric problems, again, is absurd. Now, we've mentioned that there are more and more exorcisms around the world, henceforth the training for the Catholic priests. And where I believe that each diocese now has an exorcist priest in the United States, because these things are really, really called for today. And, when you look at Christianity earlier, you had this influx of demonic possession and acts of demonic activity that the Christians had to deal with, because Christianity was just getting off the ground floor. So you saw the battle really picking up. You saw it head to head. And we flash forward 2,000 years later, we see the same thing happening right now. And it may not be a surprise to some that we see this battle between good and evil, Satan and God, the demonic, the demons and the angels. So we see this again, and we see the uptick here in the need for exorcisms and the actual confrontation of these demons to exorcise and expel them from the people that they have possessed. So we see, again, this is mirroring what happened in the early church. So very, very important. Now, according to this Q event, that 80% of attendees that were at this event had rarely or never heard of a talk on the demonic realm. Now, and maybe that's true of your particular parish. And it's kind of funny. Now, maybe that's not the right word, because really it isn't funny. But when you look at it, and we look at all the problems in the world today, and they're enormous problems. Tensions with Iran, tensions with Korea, terrorism attacks here, civil wars here, another socialist agenda in Venezuela, it just collapsing, and the people really suffering. Starvation, the environment in big trouble. I mean, so many things, scandals in the Vatican, scandals in this church, scandals in the Jewish church, scandals in the school system. I mean, and certainly politics. It's just incredible. And we're seeing things that weren't permissible years ago that are now turned into law. And a complete 180 in the way people think and believe. And yet we don't hear about the demonic. And yet we see it, or should see it, because it's right in our face, so to speak. And we're just tending to ignore it and closing the window and pretending, well, you know what? If I can't smell that bad air, I'll just shut this window and I won't have to worry about it. And from following the show, if you have, that Satan is a real enemy, and so are the demons. And they want nothing more than to destroy us, to destroy the countries we live in, certainly to destroy families, so these demons and Satan get at the church. That is critical, because Satan wants to destroy everything that God created, because he hates God so much. He hates us because God created us, and he hates this creation because God indeed created it and said it was all good. And if you're a Catholic and you're living that gospel life, you're receiving the sacraments, and you're trying, and God knows you're trying, you don't have to be afraid of the devil. You have more power than the devil. The devil's trick is to tempt us. That's how we get into trouble with him, is the temptation. Padre Pio said that curiosity was the greatest, one of the greatest sins, because that's once that thought gets in our mind, that temptation, we get curious about it. And then we want to find out about it. And then we may act on it. And that's where we get into trouble. That curiosity leads us into a path that in some cases may be very difficult for us to pull ourselves out and find our way back. So very important to realize that the devil uses these temptations. But again, the power of the sacraments, the power of daily Mass, confession, you don't have to fear the devil if you're doing these things. And by all means, people that are doing this, in all likelihood, are not going to be dabbling in the occult. That is something we should really not do. Now, according to Mr. Bly, in his talk, he gave some very interesting points at the conference. And one, we know this, that the spiritual world is very legalistic. Now, as he said, demons are bound by the rules of God. And that's important for us to remember, because God is above Satan, God is above the demons. He has given rules, and they have to operate according to those rules. So that's why I mentioned a moment ago, the devil, the demons, they try to get us, destroy us through temptation. And it's important for us to remember that God is still in control. And because of that, he gives us the strength. I just mentioned, confession, the sacraments, that when we battle these temptations, when we defeat these temptations, we become and grow spiritually stronger. So Christ is using this as a way to let us be engaged in this battle, and yet for us to win more and more victories until we get the final victory in the war that Christ won for us, so we can grow stronger. Another important point, which we've mentioned on other shows, is that, again, if you're living that Christian life, and you're a Catholic, and you're receiving, again, the sacrament, especially confession, where you're absolved of those sins and get that spiritual grace, that sanctifying grace, which helps us to grow spiritually, to grow stronger, we don't have to worry about these demons. I mentioned a minute ago that it's when we start to dabble in the occult. And why is that? Because we open that portal and we open that channel, and make no mistake about it, they're there. That's part of our reality. Even if we ignore it, it's still there. In essence, we are inviting the demons in. So it's like by getting into witchcraft, by getting into palmistry, by some of these games, by some of these movies, things that don't really seem like a threat, it's as if we're opening that door, maybe just a crack at first, a little bit to see who's there, but slowly, well, maybe we reckon, we'll open it more, and the next thing you know, they're in. And that is why we have to stay away from the demonic. Because sin seems to be attractive to us. And in many times, Satan, these temptations, they come at pretty packages. They're not really the monsters, although we will at one point see them for the monsters that they can be. And in some cases, we can see it right off the bat. But they are usually pretty packaged so that we can slowly open the door a little bit where we don't think it's a threat until the invader is in the home. Now, in the other show I mentioned that, you can check it, and we did about the demonic activity, I mentioned that full possession. We explained that there's infestation, oppression, and they're a little different. You can archive the show if you want to see the differences in them. But they're all tools of the demons. But full possession is the one where you need the exorcist priest. And you don't want to go there. The others are bad enough. And you can check out the show on that. Some of the stuff, like you might have seen or heard about things flying around the room, steps up and down, footsteps up and down the people's stairs, hearing things, voices. In some activities, you can see ghosts. So it was an interesting show, I think, and if you're interested in this, you might want to check that out on the archives. And the bottom line here is that we invite the devil in. And it can also be people, especially Italy, curses are popular, where the parents can also invite a demon into their child or others by performing a curse. So, again, this is heavy-duty stuff, and it's a part of our reality. And, we have authority over our families, over our own bodies, and over our homes. And so we can renounce and reject Satan. And I gave that beautiful prayer that called the Unity Prayer, and you can check that out on one of the shows. And I think it's the Flame of Love Ministries that you may be able to get a prayer card or go online. They have 4 beautiful prayers that can blind Satan to us, to see us. And that's important. So in Jesus' name, we can claim authority over these demons in these lesser demonic activity. Now, in the full possessions, and demons would know this, they know who has spiritual authority, so they won't listen to someone that doesn't. But when the priest does this, see, that's the authority of the exorcist priest. And it's interesting because some Protestants have come to the Catholic Church because, again, they have that ability to perform the rite of exorcism. So in serious cases of possession, the Protestants have come to the Catholics to help out. So it's important to realize what our authority is, because you can get in a world of trouble over your head if you don't have an authorized authority and try to confront demons that would not recognize the authority you think you have. You can get into worse trouble than that. So you got to be very careful. It's the same with deliverance ministries. Those people are trained, and it's important if you wanted to get involved in something like that to get the training, so you don't actually create more of a problem than there is already. Now, the authority that the exorcist priest comes from the church, because what we do is we believe that when Christ proclaimed Peter as the rock upon which he would build his church and laid hand on him, that we have a lineage of popes right now to Pope Francis that are unbroken. So the authority of the church is what we're looking for here in these possessions that are full and need an exorcist priest, because Jesus is doing the work. But again, he's using the priest, he's using us as tools. So, very important, because again, we're seeing excess now and a rise in the demonic and an exorcism, and part of it, again, is because of this lack of faith in God and lack in belief. Again, we're going back to the early days of Christianity when the battle was taking place, when it was raging, as Christianity was exploding. So now we see this approach where, we're at that battle point again, but because of the lack of faith, the demons are emboldened. So, again, important for us to recognize that this activity is real, but it's also important for us, especially Catholics. Again, we mentioned about the prayer and the sacraments and living that Catholic Christian life. You don't have to be afraid of that. And so therefore, you can't be seeing demons in everything that happens in your life, especially tragedies and things that, don't make you happy. You've got to be careful that you don't find the devil behind every door, okay? Because there are some cases, certainly, and that's one of the things when they do the exorcism and they check about it, they exhaust every psychological, every medical problem exhaustively to make sure that it's not of this material world. but of a supernatural attack before that right exorcism is granted. So, because there are problems that people have, and it's all not the demonic. As a matter of fact, when you look at that, they determine that it's non-explainable. So it's outside the material realm. It's outside the realm of the sciences. And there have to be extraordinary signs. Example, like I mentioned, knowing a language, hidden things about somebody's life, especially if they're very specific. I mentioned the supernatural strength of the early ancients. So when you look at this, these are all signs that this is, again, of the supernatural. And it's tough, and this is why we don't have authority and we need the exorcist priest, because people do suffer from psychiatric ailments. There's, depression, and people think of suicide. You've got the bipolar. There's schizophrenia. So experts have to be called in to determine whether this is a supernatural cause or not. But, again, we, by not involving ourselves in such things as magic and the demonic, we can save ourselves a lot of grief. And I think it's important that we talk about this in our parishes, in our churches, especially with the kids. Now, I heard one case where one priest had given a sermon on this, and one of the parents waited for him after the Mass was over to say, you're fighting my kid. You scared him with this talk about the devil and hell. But, maybe they need, these youngsters today, these young people today, maybe they need to hear about it because they are searching the occult. They are, and especially with access to the Internet. It's very popular for them, and they're going to find it. And the devil will get involved with them if we're not going to. And, we need to talk about these things to the young, to tell them it's a problem. And I really believe if we get back to this and explaining about miracles and the fight that this supernatural war for our souls is, we're going to see the youth come back. We're going to see other people come back. I really believe that. I really do. I think it's a grave mistake not to talk about this, especially a supernatural aspect of our faith, which has been, so relevant through 2,000 years of history. And when we look and see, especially the youth, looking at the occult and looking at these other things, whether it be magic, look at the Harry Potter books and how popular they are, or ghost hunting. They're looking for something. They're searching for something. But what they're doing is they're breaking our first commandment about having other gods before God. And we're looking for the power that God can give us, the comfort that God can give us. But we're looking at it in other places. And that's where they look at the divination and the power that comes with that. Because in our souls is a need for God and a need for that afterlife. But if we're searching for it, especially the youth, in the wrong places, we're going to get into a world of trouble. So we need to inform not only the parents, but the children. And we can't be afraid to talk about these things and be ready and battle ready to fight the demons with, the knowledge that we have of this, of the uptick in occult, and that Christ is the answer and not the demon. It's extremely important for us as a faith to save our children and let them know. And they're, more adult in the ways than adults are these days. They've had a lot thrown at them, and I think they can handle it. And I think the people can handle it also in the pews. I think we cannot treat them like little babies, like uneducated people. I think they can handle this as adults. I really do. And I think good things will happen. Because one of the most important things for us in this battle is to know the enemy. And if we ignore the enemy, it is hard to defeat him. And that's going to segue me into the next part of the show, because we're going to talk about a very powerful prayer. And this is a prayer I think that we need to talk about more again in our church. And they do this. Many churches do. Many have devotions and holy hours now. At least in our diocese up here, we're having one every church in the diocese for holy hour for vocations. But I want to give you that prayer because it's the rosary. And the rosary, as Padre Pio has said, is the weapon for these times. And there are many miracles of the rosary, and you may have seen them in your own lives from praying the rosary. And as Father Peyton used to say, the family that prays together stays together. How very true that is. That's why the devil is attacking the family, because he realizes if he can destroy the family, he can destroy everything, faith, church, because the core value of any society, of civilization, is the family. And we are stripping it down now. I heard one politician say a couple years ago, we got to redefine what family is. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? But this is what we're up against. And that rosary is powerful. So I would like to share, to get you that, pray that rosary. And ask the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And ask the intercessions on these prayers. And meditate on the mysteries of Christ in the rosary. But I want to share some miracles with you, because these are big ones. These are the home run miracles, in a way of speaking, of the rosary. Okay, so we're going to start, because we all know that Hiroshima, when we dropped the bomb, was a horrific event. And there was another bomb dropped on Nagasaki. So these two bombs convinced the warrior culture, the Japanese, that they couldn't win and they had to quit. Now, 140,000 people were killed or injured in Hiroshima. The devastation, the carnage, incredible. And there was a home that was about 8 blocks, 1 kilometer from where the bomb went off. And this particular house had a church attached to it. And this was completely destroyed. But the home survived. And so did the 8 German Jesuit missionaries who had prayed the rosary in that house faithfully every day. This was ground zero of the A-bomb. And these Jesuit priests, these German priests, they were missionaries to the Japanese people. Now, they were non-military, and Germany and Japan, of course, were allies, so they were permitted to live and minister within Japan during the war. Yet despite being at ground zero, 8 blocks away, not only did all 8 survive, they had minor injuries, but they also lived well past that awful day with no radiation sickness, no loss of hearing, and no other visible long-term defects or maladies. Now, obviously, people wanted to know what happened here. We had 140,000 people killed or injured, and we have many side effects from this. So scientists, healthcare people, they wanted to find out what happened here. Why did these guys survive? And basically, Father Schiffer, he was one of the priests, said that we believe, and I quote, we believe that we survived because we were living the message of Fatima. We lived and prayed the rosary daily in that home. Again, we believe that we survived because we were living the message of Fatima. We lived and prayed the rosary daily in that home. Wow. Wow. Living the message of Fatima and praying the rosary daily. Ground zero. And they lived well beyond the A-bomb attack in 1945. Okay, let's go on to another miracle. Now, 3 years, Austria was a Catholic country, and it was under tyrannical rule in these 3 years of communist Russia after World War II. And you know, it was brutal under the Nazis, but we look at Poland, and then the Poles were so happy that the Nazis were booted out and the Russians came in. And the sad fact of the matter is that the Russians actually were worse than the Nazis to the Poles. So as this Cold War heated up after World War II, countries like Austria, there were serious problems. And they were under this authority, this tyrannical authority of Russia. And it was a Franciscan priest named Father Petrus. And he remembered during this turmoil the story of how Christians in the 16th century had defeated the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto, which we're going to talk about, through the Rosary. That's how we get our October feast, through Lepanto, in October, the Feast of the Rosary. But we'll get there. Now, Father Petrus then said, you know, if they could have done that, and they were granted a miracle, I'm going to do the same here for my country. And he launched a Rosary Crusade where 70,000 people pledged to say the Rosary daily with the specific intention of Austria becoming free from Russian rule. Now, Austria was very valuable to the Soviets because of its strategic location and its rich resources. Yet on May 13th, 1955, May 13th may ring a bell, that is the day that Our Lady appeared, the first apparition at Fatima in 1917 on May 13th. And on that day in 1955, May 13th, the Russian regime, completely atheistic, in a completely unprecedented move, signed an agreement to leave Austria. Now, not one person was killed, not even one person was shot, and no shot was even fired. And even to this day, historians and military strategists cannot explain why the Russians pulled out of Austria. Yet, those who pray the Rosary, those who know the love and the love of Christ, and know, as Padre Pio said, that the Rosary is a weapon for these times, and pray for peace, well, they know. They know. Okay, I mentioned that we would look at the Battle of Lepanto, 1571. And this was an important, very important Rosary miracle because the Muslim Turks, they, if winning this battle, in all likelihood, Christianity would have been stamped out. So this Battle of Lepanto, October 7th, 1571, took place. And this was at the end of the Crusades. And it took place between the Catholic naval forces and the Muslim naval forces, which was considered at that time the greatest navy, the Muslims, in history. And the Catholic naval forces were not only at a decided disadvantage in numbers, tremendously so, but also resources. And it looked, even though these brave men went to battle, they could not win. There was just too much stacked against them in these numbers of men and these resources that the Muslims have. The greatest naval military up to date. So knowing that the odds for victory were extremely poor, St. Pope Pius V requested all of Europe to pray the Rosary. Now, the Pope, while performing his duties in the Vatican, miles away from the battle, he suddenly stood up. And this was at the moment of victory of the Catholic naval forces. And he went over to a window and exclaimed, "The Christian fleet is victorious." And he started to cry. You see, because what happened at that moment was that the Muslim naval force had encircled the Catholic naval forces and were about to destroy them, when all of a sudden a strong wind blew up and it scattered that blockade of Muslim forces. And it enabled the Catholic forces to attack. And they won that victory when the forces were scattered. And nature helped the Catholic forces to overcome the advanced numbers of the Muslims and win the battle. And through the power of the rosary that Pope St. Pius V requested, and all of Europe complying, they won. And this was a pivotal battle in history because Christianity survived. And we see from many centuries later that it continues and will continue because the gates of hell will not prevail against Christ's church. So we have the rosary to pray, brothers and sisters. And even if you're a Protestant listening to the show, please learn the rosary. It is a beautiful prayer, and you will come to love it. And you will see the changes in your life. Because in all these cases that I'm going to name, in all these miracles, we see a constant thread. And the thread is what Our Lady said at Fatima, that if we pray this rosary, we could have avoided World War II. So she tells us that in the rosary, the very nature and forces of war can be prevented. And that even nature itself, can be stopped with storms and disasters that plague our planet. The forces of nature are even subject through Christ in this rosary prayer that we can pray. Okay, this next miracle, and it's a country that has its problems now, but still a Catholic country, and these are the Philippines. And under President Marcos, and this is a relatively modern miracle, President Marcos and his wife, Imelda, as we know, because this isn't that far off ago, they lived in lavish luxury while the poor starved. And, you know, it's funny because even today in the Philippines, the people make jokes about Imelda Marcos' shoes because she had over 3,000 pairs, 15 mink coats, 508 fancy gowns, and 1,000 purses. And the people wanted no more of President Marcos and his extravagance. They wanted a new president, Benigno Aquino. And what happened? Well, this popular man that they wanted to elect was assassinated right in front of his wife and family when he stepped off a plane to run for that office in Manila. After this brutal murder, Aquino's wife, Corazon Aquino, and Corazon is interesting because it means heart. That's what her name means. She became active in protest against the Marcos regime. Now, the people of the Philippines wanted her to run for president. And they got as much as 1 million signatures urging her to do so. So she fulfilled the people's wishes. Now Marcos, he calls for a snap election on February 7th, 1986. And, of course, it turned out to be a bloody, violent, and it was fraud-filled event. Fraud-filled. Marcos declared the winner by his corrupt government and immediately took control of the media. And what did he do? He sent out the military to quell any protests because the people were very angry, because this was a farce. Now, the cardinal of the Archdiocese of Manila, Cardinal Sin, he urged the peaceful protests and that the Catholic people come out in droves, but to be peaceful. And the people did. And they surrounded the military tanks, and they surrounded the soldiers. And what did they do? They did not fight. They did not shoot. They prayed the rosary and sang religious and protest songs. Holy masses and prayer vigils took place in the churches. And the prayerful protests continued for almost a week. And after that week, the soldiers stepped away from their tanks. And they put down their guns. And you know what they did? They joined the peaceful crowd. And Marcos, seeing this, he fled the country. And he left February 26 in 1986. And the whole nation took to the streets in celebration. Again, prayers of thanksgiving and holy masses were held for gratitude in what God had given them. And as the new president, Cory Aquino, she made sweeping changes, and the Philippines became a free and democratic country. And even to this day, people are still in awe of the evil and corrupt regime of Marcos. But through a completely peaceful means and peaceful praying of that rosary and those protests that were peaceful, his regime was overturned. So we can pray the rosary for a more moral government and to have leaders with integrity, and certainly to put an end to evil regimes. So very important, very important. Okay. Let's go to another miracle. You'll find this interesting because this also is modern, and I think you'll be familiar with this name. And this was in 1978. And you might remember the name of a very, very dangerous serial killer named Ted Bundy, who they know murdered at least 40 people. And they think that it may be as high as 100, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning on January 15th. And Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. And he murdered 2 girls. And then he headed off in search for more victims. And he came to a 3rd girl's room. And he had a bat. And he was going to kill her with that bat. But when he went in, he saw a rosary clutched in her hand. And he dropped the bat and fled. Later, the girl told the authorities that before she left for college, she had promised her grandmother that she would pray the rosary every night for protection, even if she fell asleep in the process. And this is what she had done that night, that particular night on January 15th. And she was still holding that rosary when Ted Bundy entered that room. Now, Father Joseph Esper, and if you ever get a chance to see him, he's written many books, and if you can't see him at a conference, by all means, check out his books. You'll find them very interesting. He wrote in his book, With Mary to Jesus, and I quote, "Ironically, when Ted Bundy was on death row awaiting execution for his crimes, he asked Monsignor Kerr to serve as a spiritual counselor to him and the priest took the opportunity to ask about that terrible night. And Bundy explained that when he entered the girl's room, he had fully intended on murdering her, but some mysterious power was preventing him. Father Esper adds, and not only does the rosary, aid our own spiritual growth, it also undermines the kingdom of Satan. And the famous Vatican exorcist, Father Gabriel Amorth, he testified, one day a colleague of mine heard the devil say during an exorcism, every Hail Mary is like a blow on my head. If Christians knew how powerful the rosary was, it would be my end. I'm going to repeat that from Father Gabriel Amorth, the famous exorcist priest. Quote, one day a colleague of mine heard the devil say during an exorcism, every Hail Mary is like a blow on my head. If Christians knew how powerful the rosary was, it would be my end. So we can pray that rosary daily for protection to defeat the forces of evil. So we see this powerful prayer. And I'm going to try and share one more rosary miracle before the show ends. And it was about this gentleman named Bartolo Longo. And he was born in 1841 to a devout Catholic family. And as he grew up, he wanted to study law. And at that time in the 1840s, Naples was undergoing a tremendous spiritual crisis. Paganism, like today, is back. Satanism, all sorts of stuff in the occult were abounding. And Bartolo was not immune to this. In fact, he became a satanic priest. And his family was just mortified, tried to get him their hardest to come back and convert. But as Satanism began to torment his mind, his family convinced him to make a good confession. And Alberto Redente, a saintly Dominican priest, he helped him back to the Catholic faith and encouraged Bartolo to have a devotion to the rosary. And he had this miraculous conversion. And in 1870, Bartolo became a Third Order Dominican and chose to live a life in penance after all the terrible sins he committed against the church. Now, one day, nearly succumbing to the sin of despair because he felt that God could never forgive the tremendous sins he had committed against the church. And at that moment, he received divine inspiration, and he remembered the Blessed Virgin's promise that she would help all in their necessities who propagate her rosary. So he set out to restore this dilapidated chapel at Pompeii and promote the rosary to whoever would listen. And he had pamphlets about the rosary, and he distributed them to help the people learn to pray. And he tried to find an image of Our Lady of the Rosary worthy of hanging in the chapel. But he was only offered a worm-eating painting with an image that he felt was coarse and not worthy of veneration. But he took it. And as Bartolo continued his work for propagating the rosary, the chapel's membership grew tremendously. And many miracles began to be associated with Our Lady of Pompeii. Cures and spiritual conversions occurred. People pledged their support, and they said, we'll build a large church here to honor Our Lady of the Rosary. And in 1894, Bartolo and his wife gave the church over to the care of the Vatican. And that original image that was found in the convent was restored for the last time in 1965. And Pope Paul VI crowned the heads of Jesus and Mary with diadems given by the people of Pompeii. And on October 26, 1980, Bartolo Longo was beatified by St. John Paul II, who called him the man of the Madonna and the apostle of the Rosary. So here we see that we can pray the Rosary to receive Mama Mary's heavenly aid in saving souls. So please, please, have this as one of your devotion. And if you can, include your family in it. It is awesome. It is awesome. And as Padre Pio, once again, I'll say it, claimed, the Rosary is a weapon for our times. Good night, and God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.